This is not breaking news. This is not a scandal. This is not about one person. This is about what happens when a system built on rules quietly discovers that its rules no longer work. For a long time, we've assumed something basic, that laws enforce themselves, that courts, once they speak, are obeyed. That accountability is automatic. It isn't. Today, something rare happened inside an American institution. Not loud, not theatrical. A procedural move, a cold one, the kind that only happens when every softer option has failed. It signals a danger most people don't notice until it's too late. Not corruption, not ideology, but the moment enforcement stops functioning and authority has to beg for help. If you're watching this expecting drama, stay with me, because the most destabilizing failures don't announce themselves. They escalate quietly, on paper, at first, and once that line is crossed, it doesn't uncross itself. Watch closely, because what comes next depends on whether anyone still has the power to stop it. For decades, we told ourselves the system was controlled by laws, by precedent, by norms so internalized they didn't need enforcement. That's no longer true. What actually controls the system now is leverage, money that makes penalties irrelevant, visibility that turns punishment into fuel, a following large enough to make enforcement feel dangerous. This is the quiet transfer of power most people miss. Not from one branch to another, but from institutions to individuals who can outlast consequences. Courts were designed to compel compliance. But compulsion only works when resistance is costly. When defiance escalates faster than response, authority starts negotiating instead of enforcing. That's the shift. Rules still exist. Orders are still written, but the cost-benefit math has inverted. And once that happens, the system doesn't fail all at once. It hesitates, it delays, it hopes the behavior corrects itself. That hesitation is not neutral. It trains everyone watching. Because if one actor can ignore the system and keep moving, others will try next. And that's when this stops being theoretical. For a long time, this worked because the shift was slow. Before defiance was rare, costly, embarrassing. Before ignoring a court order ended careers. It isolated you, it collapsed support. Now, defiance is normalized, monetized, broadcast. What changed wasn't the law. It was the timeline. Violations used to be punished before they could compound. Now they stack faster than institutions can respond. Warnings lag behavior. Consequences trail damage. That delay is everything, because each unpunished violation quietly resets expectations. The next one feels smaller, less shocking, more survivable. Over time, enforcement doesn't disappear. It thins. It becomes conditional, selective. And the most dangerous part is how ordinary it feels while it's happening. No alarms, no collapse, just repetition. This is how systems lose authority without anyone voting to remove it. Not through rebellion, through tolerance. And once tolerance replaces enforcement, the system starts borrowing power it doesn't actually have. That's when pressure builds elsewhere. And that pressure always finds a release. Then the system hits a moment it can't absorb quietly anymore. Not a collapse, a spike, a single case where the normal tools are used, warnings, fines, formal orders, and none of them work. Not once, not twice, but repeatedly. Each response is logged, documented, escalated exactly the way the rule book says it should be. And each time, the behavior continues. At that point, the crisis isn't the violation itself. It's the realization that compliance is no longer being negotiated in good faith. This is where institutions face a choice they were never meant to make. Keep pretending enforcement still functions, or admit on the record that it doesn't. What happened next was not dramatic. It was procedural. A move so rare most people don't even know it exists. A formal acknowledgement that the system had run out of internal force, that it had reached the edge of its authority. If you're still watching, stay right here, because this is the moment where quiet failure turns into constitutional risk. And once an institution says, I can't compel this anymore, someone else has to decide whether they can, and that decision carries consequences no one fully controls. What matters next is how that handoff actually works, because the system doesn't collapse when authority fails. It reroutes. When courts can't enforce, they escalate upward, not emotionally, not structurally. They transfer the problem to a body with a different kind of power, not judicial, political. Here's the mechanism most people never see. Judges don't have armies. They don't control budgets. They can't neutralize influence. They rely on legitimacy and compliance. Legislatures do something else. They impose consequences that don't require obedience. They remove status. They strip protection. They change who the rules apply to. This is why escalation feels shocking, but it isn't impulsive. It's what happens when enforcement failure becomes systemic risk. The beneficiary, up until this point, is obvious. The actor who can delay, defy, absorb penalties, and turn punishment into proof of strength. The cost is absorbed elsewhere, by courts whose authority erodes, by norms that stop deterring behavior, by everyone else who now has to wonder whether rules still bind the powerful. This is not about punishment. It's about containment, because once the system admits it can't enforce internally, every future violation becomes more dangerous than the last. And that's when escalation stops being optional. Then the pressure accelerates. Faster now, less patience, shorter windows. What used to take months happens in days. What used to be debated quietly moves into the open. Statements harden, positions lock. Every new action creates evidence instead of resolution. This is the phase where restraint disappears, because escalation feeds on itself. Each move forces the next one to be bigger, louder, more final. You can see it in the responses, in the speed, in the security posture, in the way language shifts from process to threat. No one explains anymore. They prepare. And here's the dangerous part. At this stage, even compliance doesn't restore stability. The damage is already done. Authority has been tested publicly and survived only by escalating beyond itself. That sends a message outward, to other actors, other cases, other moments of stress. If enforcement required emergency measures once, it can be challenged again. And now the system is moving with momentum it didn't choose, decisions made under pressure, with limited options and no clean exits. This is where mistakes become irreversible, because when institutions move this fast, they're no longer shaping events, they're reacting to them. This is where it stops being abstract, because while institutions argue about authority, you live inside the consequences. You feel it in the background tension, in the uncertainty that seeps into ordinary decisions. Work, travel, safety, trust. When enforcement breaks at the top, it doesn't stay there. It changes what people expect everywhere else. Rules feel optional. Outcomes feel unstable. And the future starts to look negotiable, not by process, but by pressure. You don't need to follow every procedural detail to sense it. You notice it when the system feels louder but less solid, when nothing resolves, when everything escalates. This is the psychological cost of institutional failure, not fear, fatigue, the sense that the guardrails are thinner than you were taught, that stability depends on personalities instead of rules. And that's why moments like this don't end cleanly. Because once people stop believing enforcement is automatic, they start preparing for alternatives. That's not panic, it's adaptation. And adaptation, when it spreads, reshapes societies faster than any law ever could. Stay with me, because what happens next doesn't stop at borders. What happens next never stays contained, because systems like this are watched closely, quietly. When enforcement falters in one place, it recalibrates expectations everywhere else. Allies notice hesitation. Adversaries notice opportunity. Markets notice instability before headlines do. The signal isn't chaos, it's unpredictability. Agreements rely on the assumption that rules will be enforced tomorrow the same way they were yesterday. When that assumption weakens, trust thins. Coordination frays, risk premiums rise. This is how local breakdowns become global friction, not through collapse, through doubt. Capital hesitates, diplomacy slows, security planning adjusts, and none of this requires a single dramatic failure, just the visible strain of institutions operating at their limits. The danger isn't that the system falls apart, it's that it keeps functioning, but differently, more defensively, more cautiously, more brittle. Because once the world sees that enforcement depends on emergency escalation, every future commitment carries a question mark. And uncertainty, once exported, doesn't come back easily. It lingers, it compounds, and it reshapes the environment the next crisis will arrive in, which brings us to the question no one wants to answer yet. What happens when the system reaches the point where every option is costly and delay becomes its own decision? From here, the future stops being a single outcome. It fractures. There are three paths, none of them clean. The first is adjustment. Institutions recalibrate. New limits are clarified. Enforcement becomes faster, sharper, less forgiving. The system survives by becoming harder, more explicit, less trusting. It works, but at a cost. Flexibility is lost. Grace disappears. Every future conflict is handled closer to the edge. The second path is erosion. Nothing breaks outright. No final confrontation. Just normalization. Each exception becomes precedent. Each escalation becomes background noise. Rules still exist, but only on paper. Authority depends increasingly on who's willing to push hardest. The system keeps moving, but hollowed out. Stable until it isn't. The third path is rupture, a moment where escalation collides. Legal process meets mass pressure. Authority meets refusal. The system is forced to choose between enforcement and legitimacy, and loses one of them. Not because it wanted to, but because delay ran out. What matters is this: none of these paths are chosen deliberately. They emerge from accumulated decisions made under pressure, from moments where postponement felt safer than confrontation. We are not at the end of the story. We are at the narrowing, and the next move doesn't determine everything, but it determines which futures are no longer available. What makes this moment dangerous isn't that the system might fail. It's that it might adapt in ways we don't recognize until they're permanent. Because once enforcement requires escalation, once authority survives only by emergency measures, that becomes the new baseline. The next conflict won't start from stability. It will start from strain. No reset button exists for this. No quiet return to normal. Every future test will arrive inside a system already stretched, already watched, already doubted. And the most important question isn't what happens to any one figure. It's whether rules still bind power, or whether power has learned how to outlast rules. That answer won't come from speeches, or votes alone, or even verdicts. It will come from what happens after the cameras move on, when enforcement is tested again and again. If you're still here, stay curious, stay uncomfortable, because the most consequential shifts don't announce themselves as endings. They announce themselves as procedures, filed quietly, justified carefully, and normalized before anyone agrees on what changed. This story doesn't conclude tonight. It continues in the next test, the next escalation, the next moment when authority is challenged. And if you want to understand where this is actually heading, you'll want to follow what comes next.